Hey, welcome back to the wood shop. Today we're talking about table saw safety. So we've taken our long board to the miter saw, we've cut rough length, we've taken it over to the jointer and we've jointed one surface and one edge 90 degrees to each other. Now the next step is to cut our piece to rough width on the table saw. Rough width means I'm going to take my finished width, I'm going to add 1/8 of an inch, leave a little bit of extra to make a nice edge on the planer, and I'm going to cut to rough width on the table saw. So the primary function of this table saw is to use the fence to cut to width, or rough width in this case. This is called a rip cut. So I'm going to be making a rip cut on this table saw using the fence. A rip cut is a cut that's along the same direction as the grain of the wood. So a rip cut is going to be along the grain of the wood. In order to make a safe rip cut on the table saw, I'm going to need a fence, but I'm also going to need 3 other things. And those things are a splitter or a riving knife to make sure that the wood stays straight and doesn't cross over the blade. I've also got some fancy anti-kickback fingers, these sharp pointed fingers that keep the wood from kicking back towards me. And I've also got a plexiglass guard that locks in place on top of this splitter to keep the wood from flying up at me and to keep my hand away from the blade as well. So these 3 things, the splitter, anti-kickback fingers, and the guard, need to be in place when I'm making a rip cut on this saw. So I'm going to pull out the table saw insert painted red. This is a no-go zone. We never really want to have our hands in this area when we're cutting. My saw is off, the switch is off, there's no power to it. I can even pull the paddle a couple times and make sure that this isn't going to turn on while I'm working on it. And I'm going to flip up my gray handle and I'm going to put my splitter in place. Now there is a splitter in place already for really thin cuts. This is just the splitter, just the riving knife. But in this case I want to use the guard. So I'm going to put this black splitter in place. I'm going to close the dust door and I'm ready to go. I'm going to leave the guard off for now just to get my blade set to the right height and the width of my fence set. Before I make my cut, I need to make sure that my blade is high enough it's going to cut the wood, but not so high it creates a hazard. To do that, I'm going to unlock the hand wheel on the front. I'm going to raise the blade up until the blade is 5 millimeters higher than the workpiece. This is about 1 tooth, so 1 tooth higher than the workpiece. I can put my workpiece right beside the blade, have a look, and I'm ready to cut. Once again, if the blade is too high, it creates a hazard. If it's too low, it's not going to cut the wood completely. We allow for a little bit of variation in the wood by having those teeth a little bit higher. So the next thing I want to do is set my cut with the fence. So if I want a piece, say that's about 2 inches, I simply use my tape measure, or I can use a tri-square, and I can set the distance from my fence to my blade at 2 inches. Now a little bit of technical work here. When I lock my fence in place with this red handle, it's going to bring the fence to 90 degrees. So I want to make sure that after I set my measurement and lock it in place, it's the same. Sometimes I get my fence set to 2 inches, and then when I lock it, it moves ever so slightly. It's no longer 2 inches. I'm going to get it exactly to where I want it, and I'm going to lock it in place at 2 inches. Of course, my workpiece is more than 1 foot long. Anything shorter than 12 inches or 1 foot is going to create a hazard. It's harder to control and it could move as I work past the blade. So make sure that your workpiece is 1 foot long if you're making a rip cut on the table saw. My guard needs to be in place. My anti-kickback fingers are down, they're in place. And my wood, the workpiece has a jointed edge and a jointed surface. The jointed edge is going to go against the fence, and the jointed surface, check mark from our last safety video, is going to go against the table. That creates a nice square edge and surface against my fence and my table, a nice sturdy cut, a nice straight cut. Lastly, we have a magnetic featherboard that's going to do the job of holding this workpiece in place for me. That way I don't have to have my hand beside the workpiece while I'm cutting. It's just an extra hand. So this magnetic featherboard not only holds a little bit of flex with the fingers, holds my piece tight against the fence, it's also going to keep it from kicking back because these fingers are pointing ahead. So I'm going to pull that in place with one hand, and I'm going to lock those two magnetic locks with the other hand. Now my piece is nice and tight against my fence. Now, because my hand is going to come within a hand width of the blade as I cut, I'm going to need to use a push stick of some kind. Simple push stick or a fish stick, either one will do. For a longer workpiece, I like to use a long push stick that's going to hold pressure down as I push through past the blade. The way the blade rotates towards me is it's cutting down on the front, but it's cutting up on the back. It wants to lift that workpiece. So I have to put down pressure on the workpiece as I feed it past the blade. In the one case where I don't have to use push sticks is if I have a really wide workpiece, when I can safely make that cut without my hand being within that hand width of the blade. I'm safe to make that cut with just my hands. This workpiece, I'm making a rip cut. This longest side is here, so I'm going to put it against the fence this way. I would never use the fence to cut this way because the longest side is here, not here. Always push the stock between the blade and the fence until it is past the back of the blade. Otherwise, the wood inside between the fence and the blade could kick back. The way the blade is rotating towards me wants to throw the piece of wood towards me. So I'm always going to push the workpiece right past the blade so it's not contacting that anymore. This piece is pinched here so it can kick back. The workpiece on the outside of the blade, this side, or the waste piece, I'm not concerned with. I'm not going to try to hold that or push that through. That piece will simply sit there and vibrate if it catches the blade at all. It's not going to get thrown back. Once I'm finished my cut, I'm going to stop the table saw. I'm going to wait till the blade stops rotating. Then I'm going to go around the table and I'm going to retrieve my workpiece off of the back of the table. What we're trying to avoid here is reaching over the blade to get my workpiece. This creates an obvious hazard. So let's make that cut. I'm going to power up the saw. This is a saw stop saw. Has to run through some protocols. It's going to do some computer checks. I can pull the paddle and I can make my cut. You'll notice where I was standing during that cut was to the side of the blade. You can stand to the left, you can stand to the right, but you never want to stand in the path of the wood in case it does kick back. Now we have a waste piece here. It's in the red zone near our red table saw insert. What you want to do is use your push stick or use your workpiece to push that piece away from the blade. Really good habit just to keep our hands away from that zone at all times. Make sure your waste goes in the short ends bin or in the waste bin if it's too small to be used. But what if I want to make a cross cut on the table saw? Is this possible? I have to support the piece on its longest edge, which is now here. So how do I make that cross cut? Not going to use the fence. I have a variety of tools that I can use on the table saw to make a cross cut. The first thing I need to do is remove the splitter and the guard in order to make a cross cut properly. So I'm going to power down the saw. I'm going to make sure it's got no power by clicking the paddle a couple times. And I'm going to remove the guard, pull out the insert, flip up my cam lever, pull out my splitter. Now, it's not a bad idea to leave in a splitter just in case somebody comes along to use the saw after and they forget to replace it. Now, if I want to make a crosscut on my table saw, I can use a mitre gauge. I'm supporting the wood on its longest edge against my mitre gauge as I cut. I can also use a crosscut sled. So this crosscut sled is going to slide nice and easy for me to make crosscuts with. This is a very safe tool and can be modified to make a variety of different cuts. I can even lower the blade to make partial cuts. And as I said, a table saw is a very versatile piece of equipment. We've also got some pretty complex jigs, such as this tenoning jig that I can use to make cuts as well. So in the case of a crosscut sled, the same rules apply. There's a no-go zone. Never want to have my hand in the center in the path of the blade. I can have my hand to the left, to the right, or both, and make a crosscut this way, supporting the wood on its longest edge. What I always want to avoid, no matter what, and is actually kind of a common thing every semester, is a freehand cut. A student decides to take a piece of wood and try to pass it through without using the fence, without using the mitre gauge or the sled. This is way too easy to have the wood twist, pinch the blade, and get thrown back. A piece of wood that gets thrown back at a student has a cut like this. It's a curved cut. It's a scary cut. Piece of wood that passes past the blade, gets lifted, and turns and gets thrown back at a student might have a curved cut that looks like this. Luckily, this is cedar. It's pretty light, can't do much damage. But in the case of a heavier piece of wood, it'll get thrown back at the same velocity the blade is traveling at. And of course, we're always going to wear eye protection, hearing protection, and make sure the dust collection is running when you're making cuts. So that covers our table saw safety. There's a quiz on D2L for you to write to review. And if you have any questions, please email me. Stay safe and God bless.